Am I out of touch? Or is it the kids?
No, it's the children who are wrong.
Maybe I'm just old school, or maybe just old, but when painting a model recently, I kind of fell in love with inks all over again, over contrast style paints.
There's something about them that just works better with my style. So much so that I just got this set of scale 75 inks to expand on the existing colors I already have.
This isn't going to be a review of them. I already use them, and this is just to expand on the colors I already have.
But is it all in my big bald head?
Are the new hotness actually better than the tools us older painters have been using for years? Well, there's only one way to find out. Actually test them against each other. So I'm going to pick 3 inks and 3 contrasts really close in color and see what's good for what. I do feel like I need to mention one thing before doing the experiments, and that is ink on its own isn't very useful. That's not why I like it. I like how it works when mixed with mediums. So for all of the tests, it's not going to be a straight one-to-one from the bottle comparison, but instead comparing a diluted ink in medium to a contrast.
And for the models, I'll be using a few of the Empire Hunters from One Page Rules. There are many characters and styles and details I think will work well for a slap-chop underpainting style that tends to get used with contrast. I've picked 2 of them and we'll be doing the same things on both. This is the last month of the Empire releases, and there are some big ones with it. And I mean that literally. The Empire General on Dragon is as big as they come, plus the hefty Hurricane Wagon. Even the Guard Knights are quite the bulky ones. And for a final hero model, there's the Cleric. All these and more available from the One Page Rules Patreon this month.
Test number 1 is actually my favorite use for inks and contrasts, and that's filtering. Putting a color overlay on top of an already painted area to change the hue but still see the details under it. I'm starting with it this time so that we can definitely see the effects.
To get an even layer for the filter, I'm going to use my airbrush for it, so that's going to be with both the contrast and the ink. I'm going to use 3 drops of medium in both, but since the pigment concentrations aren't the same, I'll have to eyeball those to be about the same, because 1 drop of ink just isn't the same amount of pigment as 1 drop of contrast. For the contrast, I have indigo blue dipping ink from Green Stuff World. It's not going to be the exact shade of blue to the ink I plan on using, but is very close, so that's why I picked them for this test. Since it's not so much about the color, but how it filters, how many layers it takes, and how much it covers or lets through or stains, that kind of thing. As for the model, I've started with the standard slap chop method. Prime black, zenithal gray, then dry brush some white for the edges. Normally, filtering I do over already painted surfaces, so something I would do at the end of a model. But here I wanted to make sure that I could clearly see how opaque the layer stays, so over the black and white gradient is perfect for that. So my hypothesis going into this matchup was that it actually wouldn't matter which was used just because of how much medium to paint/ink ratio was being used, and the fact that blue tends to be really good at staining anyway, and their final forms are quite similar. But when it came to actually getting it onto the model, the ink's attachment to the white was so much more immediately staining that I had a better sense of how many layers I needed to give it. It felt like it mixed into the paint already on the model, while the contrast basically just sat on top of it. It took more layers to get it to cover those whites, even with a full drop of the stuff in the medium. So I'm not going to declare one a winner or anything, they are just tools to use, so both have their use. I would say if you're trying to give something a giant shift in color, that's a job for the inks. Well, if you just want something more subtle, contrast has a much kinder pace.
One of the things that really excited me about the idea of contrast when they first came out was that maybe they would act more like the very first Citadel washes that came out right after they stopped doing ink themselves.
Because if these could do what these did, then magic was in the making. But what about the magic of these? For this test, I'm using one of the OG GW contrast paints, because that's another thing about contrasts compared to inks. I find that not all contrasts act the same between company to company. Neither do inks, mind you, but I do find inks behave in a much shorter bell curve of difference than contrasts do. So to make sure I'm getting the whole picture, I want to make sure it's not just a single brand I'm testing against. For the contrast, I'm just going to use it straight, as it's meant to be sort of a thick wash right from the pot, though it's certainly thinnable to get a more graduated wash consistency as well. For the ink though, I'm going to use medium as the binder and the ink as the pigment to make the wash, but the idea is the same, just using the brush to spread it about the leathers like the boots, belts, and quiver. I'll only give each of them a single coat of the wash, but it would be possible with both to thin out and layer up instead. But to be fair, I want to see the results after one passover. I was worried for the ink going into this one because I know how powerful Wildwood is from GW. It's got all the staining potential and some. While this ink color is one I've never used before, and the Wildwood didn't disappoint. If anything, it has too much power right from the pot and covered up a lot of the white to be really dark. But I can't use that as a knock against it because it can be thinned, but it does make it great for one coat coverage. The ink though did act much more like a wash and pooled in certain locations, but never enough to cause a heavy opacity. I was surprised how well it stained the grays and whites, but because of the consistency, in one coat it wasn't able to cover the very sharp corners. So there's quite a big contrast between the color and the still white edges. So this one's a tough one for me to judge if there's a clear outlier. I do think the ink and medium does feel much more like the old school washes, so I would use them in the same situation as the old school washes I used to love. But for a nice slap chop, the contrast seems much less effort to get right, at least for this color. I also want to announce that I've re-released my Patreon, and I'm doing things pretty differently. First of all, it's now free for anyone to join. There's no tiers at all to choose from, just hit the Become a Member button. So everyone can see previews of videos, blog posts, and anything else I think might make for a fun post. But also, in my store, I've got combo packs available, where each one has an STL miniature that's pre-supported and a painting video to go along with it. This month, it's Manuel Herrera's Pump Kit for Halloween. Get the new STL and video, as well as older ones you may have missed, on my Patreon at patreon.com/Paintman Journeying. Another thing I like to do with my inks is thin out paint with them, as they're thin like a thinner, but with pigment. So here I mixed up a green, but to make it more opaque, I added white, which made it lose some vibrancy. So to each of these pools of paint, I'm going to thin them with the contrast and the ink, which will give them some color back, but also thin them out so they're not so thick for a base coat. Contrast plus paint is up first. The goal here is to do an opaque base coat. So the point is that I want the color without making it too transparent. So I don't care about the underlayer of black, white, and gray here. I want that covered. Of course, if I was doing slap chop properly, I wouldn't, but I'll paint a bit extra on the green, for science. The tones are a little different, but I did pick pretty light yellowish greens for a fair comparison, and most of the grunt work is being done by the normal paint anyway. So I'm testing how it feels going on as much as I am the final result. I want to feel how the paint feels when thinned, with the contrast or the inks. I thought because most of the work would be done by the paint that the experience might be similar for both of them, but I did actually feel quite a few differences. When it came to adding vibrancy back into the color, the ink had more pigment to donate to that, so there was more vibrancy in the final output. But like water, it thinned the paint to the point you could see brush strokes on the flat parts, and could be prone to over thinning, making the paint more transparent and watery than you want. While the contrast does have the same problem where adding too much will make the paint too transparent, it has no such problem with the consistency, because it's just a thicker product itself. Even if you added too much, it would still behave more like a paint than a wash. So even though we have to add more to get more of the pigment to get the vibrancy, it still paints on nice and evenly with less pooling. So I was actually surprised by this one and would say the contrast makes for a better color medium, but ink still does have it beat in the vibrancy. So has this little experiment cleared up some things for me? I know going in I have a bias towards inks, so I'll just make sure that that's very clear before I get pinged for it in the comments. And I'm certainly going to keep using them for filtering with my airbrush, which is exactly what I love them for. But I was also surprised by the contrast paints in some way too, and might find myself using them more to thin my heavy body paints with rather than just a medium, just because of how they felt going on. There's something about that not quite slime texture of contrast that just make it flow really nicely from the brush. If you liked this video, please subscribe, and if you'd like to support my channel, check out my Patreon where I have new models and videos each month for you to print and paint.